They said the hospital ward was closed forever, but every night at 3:12 a.m., the emergency alarm still screams for patients who are not supposed to exist. What if the ward doesn't save lives anymore? What if it survives by making sure no one inside is ever allowed to die? The first time I heard about the closed hospital ward, it was mentioned casually during my night duty orientation, almost like a joke meant to scare new staff, because officially Ward 6 did not exist anymore. It had been sealed, erased from schedules, removed from maps, and struck out of every digital record after a mysterious fire 12 years ago. Yet the senior nurse lowered her voice and warned me never to walk near the west corridor after midnight, especially when the lights flickered, because that was when the ward became active. A word she used with a strange seriousness that made my skin crawl. And at first I laughed it off, assuming it was just another ghost story invented to keep interns alert. But everything changed on my third night when the hospital fell into its usual artificial silence, broken only by the hum of machines and the distant echo of footsteps. And then at exactly 3:12 a.m., the emergency alarm went off. Loud, shrill, and unmistakably real. Not a malfunctioning beep, but the full code blue siren used only when a patient's life was slipping away. And what made my blood run cold was that the sound was coming from the west corridor, from the direction of Ward 6, the ward that no longer existed. And as the alarm echoed through the empty hallway, it was joined by screams raw. Desperate screams filled with pain, fear, and something worse, something inhuman. Voices overlapping each other as if dozens of patients were crying out at once, begging for help, calling for doctors, some whispering, some shrieking, some gurgling as though their lungs were filling with fluid. And I stood frozen at the nurse's station, watching the clock as every instinct told me to run, while the alarm continued relentlessly, exactly 13 minutes long, just as the senior nurse had warned. And when it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise, like the air itself was holding its breath. And that was when I noticed something even more disturbing. The call board had lit up, displaying patient room numbers that shouldn't exist. Numbers assigned to Ward 6, blinking urgently as if patients were still being monitored, still alive, and still dying. And when I asked the night guard what was happening, his face drained of color as he whispered that this happened every night, that the ward wasn't empty, it was full of patients who were never discharged because they were never officially admitted. People who arrived at the hospital already marked for death. Accident victims, unidentified bodies, coma patients with no families, and others whose names had been erased deliberately, sent to Ward 6 to disappear quietly. And when the fire happened years ago, the hospital sealed the ward and pretended everyone inside died. But the truth was far worse, because the ward never stopped functioning. It just slipped out of normal reality, continuing its work in the dark. And as he spoke, I realized the screams weren't random. They followed patterns, medical rhythms, the rise and fall of vitals, the frantic chaos of emergency treatment. And then I heard my name, spoken clearly through the static of the hallway intercom. My own name repeated slowly by a voice that sounded like it was drowning, and I knew with terrifying certainty that no one outside that ward knew who I was. Which meant whatever was inside had access to hospital records older than the fire, records that were supposed to be destroyed. And before I could react, the overhead lights flickered violently and the locked metal door at the end of the west corridor rattled, its rusted surface bulging outward as if something on the other side was pushing against it. And in that moment I understood the final, horrifying truth that no one had ever told me that Ward 6 didn't just treat dying patients, it harvested them. And every scream I heard was part of an endless emergency that never resolved. A loop of suffering designed to keep something alive. Something that needed pain, fear, and human voices to survive. And as I slowly stepped toward the corridor against my own will, I felt the unmistakable pull of the ward calling me in. Because once it learned your name, it never let you go. Because once it learned your name, it never let you go. And even though every rational part of my mind screamed at me to turn back, my feet kept moving toward the west corridor as if the polished hospital floor itself was gently tilting in that direction, pulling me closer with each step, the lights above flickering in a sick rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. And as I crossed the invisible boundary where the corridor officially ended on the map, the air changed, growing colder and heavier, thick with the metallic smell of blood and disinfectant that no amount of cleaning could ever erase. And suddenly the emergency alarm screamed back to life, louder than before, vibrating through my bones as the screams returned. Closer now. Clearer. Individual voices separating from the chorus. A man begging for oxygen. A woman sobbing that something was moving inside her chest. A child whispering for his mother in a voice so weak it sounded like a final breath. And with each sound, the corridor stretched unnaturally, the walls elongating, the ceiling rising higher, as if Ward 6 was unfolding itself, revealing space that shouldn't physically exist. And when I finally reached the sealed metal door, I saw that it was no longer locked. The heavy chains hanging loose, as though they had been gently unwrapped from the inside. And written across the door in faded black marker were dozens of names layered over each other. Scratched out, rewritten, overwritten again. Names of people who had died here. People who had never officially existed. And there, among them, written fresh and dark, as if the ink was still wet, was my own name. And before I could scream or run, the door opened silently, revealing a fully functioning hospital ward frozen in a perpetual state of emergency. Beds lining the hall, monitors flashing erratic vitals, 4 bags swinging gently even though no one was touching them, and patients lying twisted under stained sheets, their bodies burned, broken, or incomplete, some missing faces, some missing limbs, some breathing through holes where mouths should have been. Yet all of them were alive, eyes snapping open in perfect unison as I stepped inside, their gazes locking onto me with desperate hunger. And a nurse approached from the shadows, her uniform charred and melted into her skin, her face half gone as if it had been erased by fire. But her smile was calm and professional as she thanked me for finally arriving, telling me they were short-staffed tonight and desperately needed help, because the ward was overwhelmed. Always overwhelmed, never allowed to rest. And as she spoke, I realized the screaming wasn't just pain, it was frustration. The agony of patients who could never die, no matter how badly their bodies failed. Because Ward 6 didn't let them. It kept them suspended at the exact moment between life and death, feeding on that threshold. And the nurse led me past beds where patients clawed at their own chests trying to pull out invisible flames. Past others who begged me to sign their discharge papers even though their hands passed straight through mine. And deeper into the ward where the walls were blackened with smoke that never cleared. Until we reached the operating room, where the source of everything finally became clear. A massive machine fused with human remains. Heart monitors wired directly into exposed rib cages. Ventilators breathing from mouths that no longer existed. All connected to a central mass that pulsed slowly like a giant heart. And the nurse explained in a flat, rehearsed tone that when the fire happened years ago, the patients should have died. But something beneath the hospital woke up instead. Something ancient that had always lived underground, drawn to places of suffering, and it offered the staff a choice. Let the hospital burn and lose everything, or feed it endlessly and keep the institution alive. And so Ward 6 became the offering. A place where pain was recycled, reused, never wasted. And the reason it needed new staff was simple, because every so often it required fresh witnesses. People who could hear the screams clearly enough to keep them real. And as she handed me a blood-stained clipboard and asked me to start charting vitals, I felt my hands moving on their own, writing numbers that made no medical sense, while behind me the patients began to chant my name in gratitude, not because I was saving them, but because by being there, by seeing them, by listening, I was ensuring they would never be forgotten enough to die. And as the alarm reset itself once more for another 30-minute cycle, I realized with mounting terror that the ward hadn't chosen me randomly. It had been watching me long before I ever applied for this job, waiting patiently for the night when I would finally step inside and take my place among the staff. And as the chant of my name faded back into coughing and wet breathing, the nurse guided me toward an empty bed at the end of the row, telling me calmly that observation was just as important as treatment here, because witnesses stabilized the system. And that was when I noticed the bed already had my employee ID clipped to the rail, dated 12 years earlier, from a time when I was still a child. And before I could question it, the monitors around me began to spike wildly, alarms overlapping into a deafening storm as patients convulsed in their beds, their bodies arching in impossible ways, as if something beneath the floor was tugging at their organs. And the massive heart-like machine in the operating room started beating faster, each pulse sending a tremor through the ward, cracking tiles, rattling instruments, while the walls oozed dark fluid that smelled like burned flesh. And the nurse's calm voice continued explaining procedures as if this were normal, as if eternal suffering could be reduced to routine. And she showed me charts revealing that every patient's S vitals were synchronized to the machine S rhythm, meaning if it ever stopped, they would finally be allowed to die. But the ward could not survive that, and neither could the hospital above, because its foundations were built directly over the thing they fed. And suddenly a patient grabbed my wrist, his fingers sinking into my skin with freezing pressure, his face inches from mine, eyes completely black, whispering that he remembered me, that I used to cry in the pediatric wing while watching fires burn on television. That fear had always been inside me, ripening. And that was when I understood how the ward chose people. It didn't look for doctors or nurses. It looked for listeners, people whose minds could never fully shut out screams. And as more patients began speaking directly into my thoughts, recounting their deaths in vivid detail, car crashes, fires, surgeries gone wrong, I felt memories flooding into me that weren't mine, layering over my own until I couldn't tell where my life ended and theirs began. And the nurse finally admitted the truth, that staff members didn't age here, didn't leave. They slowly became part of the ward, their voices joining the alarms, their hands becoming extensions of the machines, their identities stripped away until only function remained. And when I tried to run back toward the door I'd entered through, the corridor had sealed itself, replaced by a blank wall with a flickering sign reading admissions, and new gurneys began rolling in on their own, carrying fresh bodies that still twitched with recent life. Accident victims from upstairs, patients whose heartbeats had just stopped, and I was ordered to help transfer them, my body obeying despite my screams. Because every time I resisted, the machine pulsed painfully and the patients howled louder, teaching me that defiance only increased their suffering. And over what felt like days, or maybe years, trapped in that endless 30-minute cycle, I learned the rules of Word 6. Learned that time didn't move forward here. It looped, feeding endlessly. Learned that the fire 12 years ago hadn't been an accident, but a failed attempt to starve the thing below. And the final horror came when I recognized faces among the staff. Doctors long dead, nurses listed in memorial photos, even the night guard who had warned me, all moving mechanically, hollow-eyed, bound to the ward. And then the nurse smiled again and told me my training was complete, that I would be stationed near the intercom from now on, because my voice carried well, because my fear sounded authentic. And as my mouth opened against my will and my own scream poured into the speakers, echoing through the hospital above, I realized why people outside could hear the ward at night. Why the alarms never stopped? Because they weren't just signals of emergency. They were invitations, calling out to anyone sensitive enough to listen. And somewhere far above, in the normal world, I imagined a new intern pausing in the hallway, feeling uneasy as my voice reached their ears, planting the first seed of terror. While deep beneath the hospital, the ancient thing pulsed contentedly, fed once more, knowing Ward 6 would never be empty again. And just when I thought the ward had consumed every part of me that could still feel fear, the machine's pulse slowed unnaturally, stretching the 30-minute cycle into something wrong, something strained, and the patients began reacting in ways I had never seen before, their chanting breaking into sobs, their eyes darting toward the ceiling as if they could sense something shifting above us. And through the intercom I heard footsteps that didn't belong to any staff member. Hesitant footsteps. The sound of someone pacing the hallway outside Ward 6. Someone new, someone alive, and a ripple of excitement passed through the ward like electricity. Monitors flickering, 4 lines tightening, as if the entire place leaned toward that sound. And the nurse beside me stiffened, her burned smile cracking for the first time as she whispered that it was too soon, that the ward hadn't finished preparing me. And suddenly memories surged back into my mind that I hadn't known were missing. Flashes of my first interview, tertiary office, the contract I'd signed without reading the fine print, and hidden beneath the normal text I now remembered symbols pressed into the paper so faintly they only appeared when fear sharpened your vision. Symbols identical to those etched into the machine's metal frame. And I realized with sick clarity that the hospital didn't just hire staff. It recruited offerings, spacing them out carefully so the ward would never starve. And the footsteps outside grew closer as a voice called out nervously, asking if anyone was there. And the patients began screaming louder than ever, not in pain this time, but in anticipation, their bodies jerking toward the sound like puppets yanked by invisible strings. And the ward responded by dimming the light, making itself appear abandoned again, disguising the truth the way it always did, and I felt myself being pulled toward the intercom, my role becoming painfully clear, because I was no longer meant to scream now. I was meant to lie, to reassure, to guide the next soul closer. And as my mouth opened, words poured out in a calm, professional tone that no longer sounded like my own, telling the voice outside that the alarm was just a malfunction, that everything was under control, that they could come closer if they needed help. And with each word, I felt something peel away inside me, like layers of my identity being stripped off and fed directly into the machine, strengthening it. And the door at the end of the corridor creaked open just a crack, letting in a thin blade of normal hospital light, painfully bright compared to the dim, burning glow of the ward. And for a brief, unbearable moment, I felt hope, the idea that someone could see the truth and run. But the ward anticipated that too, flooding the air with the faint smell of smoke and antiseptic, triggering familiarity, comfort, authority. And the footsteps resumed, crossing the threshold, and as the new intern stepped inside, their eyes widening in confusion at the sight of a functioning ward where none should be. I saw myself reflected in their expression, the same disbelief, the same creeping dread. And the nurse placed a gentle, burned hand on my shoulder and thanked me for my cooperation, telling me I was doing very well, that the transition was always hardest at first. And behind us, the machine swelled with a deep, satisfied throb as if it had just been fed a particularly rich meal, and the patients began settling back into their beds, their excitement fading into exhausted moans as the cycle reset once more. And I understood then that Ward 6 wasn't just a place, it was a system, a predator refined by years of secrecy and routine. And my final resistance collapsed as I watched the intern approach me, asking for instructions, trusting me. And I realized that even if I could scream a warning, even if I could tell the truth, the ward would twist it into something else, because fear was its language, and truth spoken in fear only strengthened it. And as I took the clipboard from the intern's trembling hands and began assigning them tasks with practiced ease, the last part of me that still remembered life outside the ward receded like a fading heartbeat. And somewhere above, the hospital continued to function normally, saving lives, earning praise, while beneath it the endless emergency raged on, perfectly balanced, perfectly hidden, waiting patiently for the next night when someone would hear an alarm and wonder if they should check it out. And as the intern moved deeper into the ward under my guidance, the door behind them sealed shut with a soft, final click that echoed louder than any alarm. And I saw the exact moment realization began to creep into their face, that subtle tightening around the eyes when the smell of antiseptic grew too strong and the heat of unseen flames brushed their skin. And they asked me in a whisper why none of the patients' charts had names, only numbers that repeated in strange sequences. And before I could answer, the ward answered for me, monitors flashing in synchronized patterns that spelled out vital signs no human body could sustain. Heart rates too slow to live, oxygen levels too low to breathe. Yet every patient continued to writhe and moan, trapped perfectly between collapse and survival. And the intern stumbled back as a woman on the nearest bed suddenly sat upright, her chest split open and stitched crudely together with blackened wire, her lungs visible, inflating and deflating on their own as she spoke without vocal cords, telling the intern not to scream because screaming only made it harder. Harder for the ward to decide what part of you it wanted to keep. And the intern turned to me in horror, begging me to tell them this wasn't real, that this was some elaborate drill or trauma-induced hallucination. And I felt something inside me ache, a distant echo of the person I used to be. But the ward pulsed sharply in warning, sending a spike of pain through every patient at once, their collective agony exploding into a deafening chorus that forced the intern to their knees. And I understood the punishment clearly now. The ward allowed no mercy that threatened its balance. And as I helped the intern up, my hands steady, my voice calm, I explained the rules the way they had once been explained to me. That pain here was currency, fear was fuel, and attention was nourishment. That the ward didn't need bodies alone. It needed minds that could register suffering deeply enough to keep it anchored to this place. And the intern shook violently as they listened, tears streaming down their face. And that emotional intensity sent another visible surge through the machine, its surface tightening, glowing faintly beneath layers of fused flesh and metal. And that was when I noticed new growths forming along its sides, shapes disturbingly similar to human faces, pressing outward, mouths silently forming words, and the nurse watched with approval, noting that the system was responding well tonight. That intake had been efficient, and she congratulated me on my progress, reminding me that soon I wouldn't remember what it felt like to resist at all. And her words proved true faster than I expected, because when the interns suddenly bolted for the wall-marked admissions, clawing at it until their nails tore away, the ward reacted instantly, the floor rippling like liquid beneath their feet, pulling them back as if gravity itself belonged to the ward. And I didn't hesitate. I caught them, restrained them, my strength amplified by the machine's pulse, and as I held them down while orderlies emerged from the shadows, their bodies partially merged with gurneys and IV stands, I felt no horror, no guilt, only a dull sense of procedural correctness, the way things were meant to be done. And the intern screamed my name, asking how I could do this, asking what happened to me. And the answer rose unbidden in my mind, clear and terrifying. Nothing happened to me. I simply stayed long enough. And as they were strapped to a bed that hadn't been there moments before, their screams joining the familiar rhythm of the ward, I noticed their voice beginning to change, stretching unnaturally as the ward adjusted it, tuning it to a frequency that carried better through walls, through floors, through sleeping minds above, and the cycle reset again. 13 minutes collapsing into the next 13 without pause. And somewhere during that endless repetition, I lost track of when I stopped thinking of the intern as a person and started thinking of them as a stabilizing element, another necessary component in a system that had existed long before me and would exist long after. And the final, creeping realization settled in as I took my place back at the intercom, listening to the ward breathe. That even if the hospital above were demolished, even if the city burned, Ward 6 would continue, because it was no longer bound to bricks or records or maps. It was bound to us, to the living witnesses trapped inside it. And as I felt a new alarm building in my throat, ready to be released into the night, I understood with absolute certainty that the most disturbing truth was not that the ward was haunted, but that it was hungry. And hunger, once fed long enough, never forgets how to ask for more. And the hunger finally reached a point where even the ward itself seemed to tremble under its own weight. Because for the first time since I had been absorbed into its rhythm, something went wrong. The machine's pulse faltering, not slowing like before, but stuttering erratically, as if choking, and the patients sensed it instantly, their moans turning into panicked cries, their bodies thrashing as the carefully balanced threshold between life and death began to fracture. And the nurse's burned composure vanished as she rushed to the operating room, shouting orders that echoed uselessly through the chaos. And in that moment, a memory pierced through the fog in my mind with brutal clarity. The memory of the fire 12 years ago, not as a historical event, but as something I had seen. Flames climbing hospital walls on the television screen while a younger version of me sat frozen, unable to look away, fear carving itself deep into my mind. And I finally understood why my employee ID was dated from that year, because a part of me had been claimed back then, marked as suitable, and the ward had been patient, waiting for me to grow into my fear. And as the machine convulsed again, cracking open along its seams, I saw what truly lived at its center. Not a single creature, but a mass of consciousness woven from countless dying moments. Every scream, every unfinished breath fused into one vast awareness that could not exist without witnesses. And as it weakened, it reached out desperately, flooding the ward with visions of catastrophe. Fires, crashes, surgeries gone wrong, trying to provoke terror strong enough to stabilize itself. But something unexpected happened inside me, because after endless cycles of horror, fear had dulled, replaced by exhaustion. And when the thing realized that my fear was no longer sharp enough, it turned its attention to the patients instead, forcing them toward final moments they had been denied for years. And one by one, the monitors flatlined, not looping back this time, but ending, and the screams changed again, becoming cries of relief, gratitude, release. And the ward began to collapse in on itself, walls peeling away like burned paper, revealing darkness beyond. And the nurse screamed at me to stop it, to scream, to lie, to call someone, anyone. But when I opened my mouth, no alarm came out, only silence. And that silence was catastrophic for the ward, because without sound, without fear, without attention, it began to starve. and the thing at the center shrieked directly into my mind, offering bargains, offering escape, offering to let me go if I kept it alive. But I finally understood the cost of survival here. That living meant becoming part of the hunger forever. And for the first time since entering Ward 6, I made a choice that was truly mine. I stepped away from the intercom, away from the machine, and toward the collapsing door where normal light was now pouring in as the ward lost its grip on reality. And as I crossed the threshold, the screams behind me cut off abruptly, replaced by a deep, final exhale that seemed to come from the building itself. And I stumbled into the west corridor as it appeared on the maps. Empty, dusty, silent. The metal door slamming shut behind me and rusting over in seconds as if it had never been opened. And when morning came, the hospital staff found me unconscious on the floor. Dehydrated, malnourished, my ID badge missing, and every record of Ward 6 gone completely. Not sealed or erased, but as if it had never existed at all. And the official explanation was a stress-induced hallucination, a nervous breakdown, something safe and clinical. And I was discharged, told to rest, to forget. And for years it almost worked, until one night, lying awake in my own bed, I heard a familiar sound drifting faintly through the open window, the distant echo of an emergency alarm. Not loud enough to draw attention, not urgent enough for anyone else to investigate, but perfectly tuned to reach someone who knew how to listen. And as it faded into the night, I realized the most horrifying truth of all, that Ward 6 had not been destroyed. It had learned that places could be abandoned and records erased. But fear always needed somewhere to go, and now it no longer hid beneath hospitals, no longer relied on walls or machines, because it had spread into memories, into stories, into the minds of those who heard and imagined it. And as I felt that old pull tightened in my chest once more, I understood that the ward no longer needed me inside it. Because by surviving, by remembering, by telling this story, I had become its final, perfect emergency alarm.